Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and today you'll hear the second part of my wide-ranging conversation with Aaron Benanav about his recent two-part long-form essay series in the New Left Review titled Beyond Capitalism 1 and 2. In the first part, we talked about theoretical groundwork for a multi-criterial economy, and in this second episode, we'll take a deep dive into the institutional design of a multi-criterial economy. So without further ado, please enjoy today's episode with Aaron Benanav talking about an economy beyond capitalism. Maybe since investment is of such crucial importance to you and for your perspective as a whole, you also describe it as a form of future making, which I really like, I have to say. Could you maybe elaborate on the mechanisms and institutions through which this central role of investment is enacted democratically? I think you already touched upon some of these elements, but as far as I understood it, it's sort of important that these things are not somewhat detached from everyday life and the broader populace, but somehow integrated into our life as a form of taking part in democratically deciding over the investment function. So how would that work in concrete terms?
Yeah, so that is, I think you're right, like the really essential part of it and the future making part of it is really the core idea that investment is how we walk towards possible futures. It's really, in a more prosaic sense, investment is just like, the purchase, the generation, building, repairing, transforming the means of production, the tools, the buildings, the machines, other structures that we have that we use to make everything in the economy. And the idea is that through investment, we're able to suffuse the economy and the ways that we produce with all these different values that people have, right? We can choose to reorganize production so that we produce more beauty in the world, or that we produce we have a more sustainable or efficient economy. Investment is really like how we transform ourselves towards these different possibilities for, increasing our well-being across all of these different dimensions. Now, I think when you talk about the democratic side, it's really important to think about investment too from two directions. One is like this bottom-up possibilities, right? The people closest to the ground, whether they are workers or consumers or other users of products in the system, they're going to be the ones who are like closest to the ground to propose from the bottom up possible changes that could be made in production, right? Maybe you work at a firm and you're like, oh, I see a possible way that we could organize this little piece of the system differently that would make our jobs just so much more fun or satisfying or enjoyable than they are right now, right? Or, a consumer or whatever could see some possibility for changing production or could at least inquire about that possibility. So we need a lot of this to be bottom up, just coming from what people notice is possible to change. But that's not enough, right? We also have a very technically complex production system. We have, large research and development organizations that we would need that are also trying to find their way forward across all these different goals. We also have the point that even though we have all these different possibilities, they add up in different ways and point us toward different possible futures. So in the piece, I talk a little bit about how maybe when we look at agriculture as a whole, maybe we want to move toward this highly automated agricultural system, that has very little labor and that's maybe like hyper efficient in terms of resources, but doesn't involve any people. But maybe we have this other vision of agriculture that has more conviviality, people involved and like the planting and growing of food in urban areas. And we kind of imagine all of these different ways, like agroecological ways of integrating food production with, other parts of life. Those are, we might have all these innovations that are just really great in themselves, but there's this role from the kind of top down of like adding that stuff up and deciding which overall futures we want to kind of move toward within our society. And so you need an investment apparatus that can integrate all of these different sources of ideas and coherence about investment. And so in the model that I develop, and I'm open to different ways of thinking about this, the front line form of organizing this are these sectoral investment boards. And I say there would be maybe about 20 of them. If you look at the OECD's division of industries, there are about 20, and they would have to be changed somewhat from that format. But one is like agriculture, then there's like mining, there's manufacturing, there's utilities, there's entertainment, there's different types of, business services. There's all these different sectors of the economy in that OECD statistical database. And the idea is that each one of these would be like function as a kind of self-managed sector of the economy. But who would be involved in that management? It can't just be the workers in that sector that are choosing representatives in some way to be on these boards. It also has to be representatives of the consumers or the users of those products, because many of them are like business services. The users are not consumers, but other workers, other companies within the economy. You would also need to involve community groups in some way, civic associations that are interested in all these different problems, and technical experts. And I talk about, again, this is one of those parts of the system where it could be arranged in many different ways. I don't have an exact theory about how it should be done, but it's very important that all these different stakeholders send people to these sort of industrial congresses, these sectoral boards, and there's a way which, I'm already talking about so long, so I don't know how much more detail to go into, but essentially like society has to decide what portion of its total resources it wants to devote to investment. So let's say that's 15% of all points will be set aside for investment. It has to make a further determination, which could be from a survey, could have all different ways of imagining how this division happens. But society has to somehow decide how those investment resources are going to flow towards the different sectors. They're going to have to be set aside for these coordinating committees as well, but a portion of all the investment resources goes to the sectors. And let's say it's, 2% goes here, 3% goes here, blah, 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 and so on. That will set the investment budget for that each sector. And then you have these elections. You have somehow people are put onto these congresses from the different stakeholder groups, and then they're just going to evaluate proposals. I say all proposals for investment have to be attached to a firm. So even if consumers or research institutes are coming up with a proposal, they have to find a firm that wants to do it, essentially, if they win. And so you have all these proposals that are coming in with different cost structures associated with them, different descriptions of the benefits that they're likely to generate. And the goal of the Congress is to try to find the frontier possibilities. So to eliminate the investment possibilities that seem worse than other ones that are also available, and then to decide, which futures they want to move towards, the imagined futures contained in the proposals, which ones they want to move towards, and also thinking very importantly about how they add up, how they are coherent. And then you can just have on these boards different ways of imagining the process of deliberation, the process of voting across these possibilities. But, to make it more concrete, like think of the healthcare sector, right? Like, you have all these clinics, you have all these hospitals, you have different ways of organizing healthcare. And people are going to say, look, we need to really improve the quality of nurses' work. Like our nurses are overburdened. They're feeling demoralized. This has to be the next important thing we invest in, is improving what they do. And someone else says, actually, the thing is that increasingly in society, we're moving towards a world where, it's not just physical health, but really mental health is becoming more and more important. So we need more investment in mental health rather than physical health, or preventative medicine, or here we figured out this new way to do like advanced gene therapy or whatever. It's like there's all these different proposals about what the next most important set of innovations are in the sector. And the investment board is just deciding every year which of those to fund and how to move forward. The thing that's really important about it that might not be obvious is that there's no rate of return on these investments. It's not like the investment board is trying to make money or trying to earn an income from the investment decisions they make. These funds are in this functional finance way just generated for society and then used within each sector. And because there's no need to earn a rate of return, that's what frees this investment from the efficiency focus, that any way of making the world better from within the sector is available. We can advance down so many different pathways. We have all these different kind of values or goals that we can realize through investment. Anything that people can convince others is like a worthwhile thing that we should do that will make the life better. Those are all possibilities for investment because we freed ourselves from the efficiency orientation or income generating orientation of investment. And so it's just a matter of democratically deciding which possible investments we want. And again, kind of ways of thinking about, on the one hand, all of these investment ideas coming from below. Here are all the possibilities. Here are things we see from our vantage point we could do. And the need to organize from above about what to choose. I should also say, I've already talked for so long, but it's very important that there's no need for consensus or agreement within these congresses. There can be a lot of conflict. People can really strongly disagree about which way to go, have big fights about it, organize coalitionally. There's no necessity within the system that, the outcome would be like a compromise across all these different groups. It could be that, there's a long simmering discontent and, conflict and different visions of the future, some of which are winning and other of which are failing. And the ones who are failing are not happy about losing, I think, there's many different ways to think about what that would look like. And the point is that there are periodic elections where people who are occupying these roles are going to be thrown out of office in different ways. And the composition of the Congress is going to change over time and reflect different kinds of values. People are going to, say like, look, we want proposals like this. This is the kind of world we're trying to build. So all of the politics of the each sectoral investment board is also going to shape what kinds of innovations people are trying to produce, because the political composition of those boards will change. There could be many ways of doing it. You could put people on the boards in many different ways. Like, I'm totally open to all these different models of what democratic, how to democratize the functions of this board. But the point is that because it's political, the composition of the board is going to be changing as people change their minds about what they think is important, how to advance forward in the sector. So that's kind of an introduction to the idea.
Hearing you talk about it, I see three crucial points where this question of democracy pops up. Like, the first one would be what you call the bottom-up planning, or proposals for investment coming from the bottom up. There, the question would be, okay, are these just proposals, or can people involve themselves into these decisions other than just periodically voting? Is there a different kind of mechanism for that? The second one would be, you mentioned that at some point there would need to be made a decision about how much of the overall capacity is set aside for investment. And you said, well, then we would have to decide like 2% here, 4% there, 5% there. This, of course, would be highly contested, and people would, as you rightly point out, fight about that, because it's basically like the crucial question of who gets what, So what are the mechanisms, at least maybe, I know there's a large space of possibility, but what would be a concrete mechanism that you could imagine for this type of question? And then the third one, I think you just basically answered. The third one would be, okay, within these investment boards, something that you always bring forward as an alternative to what Pat Devine and Fikret Adaman brought forward as negotiated coordination. As an alternative for that, you argue, and I fully agree with that it's not about like inventing a magic wand that somewhat creates a harmony within these boards. These boards, again, are crucial sites of conflict, of political conflict and contestation. So, of course, there again, it would be interesting to just hear maybe one or two examples of how these conflicts are being mediated within these institutions, because that's so crucial when you argue that we have this space of possibility popping up. This, of course, also means that we have quite a space of conflict popping up as well.
Yes.
And so it makes sense to maybe just get a taste of how you think about this question of mediating these different conflicts, because right now, much of this is also just mediated through market forces and economic pressure, so we don't want to have that. We don't think that there will be harmony. So there needs to be some kind of idea of how these conflicts can be mediated productively, somewhat productively at least.
Yeah. So I think it's very important that on the first question of the bottom up, I think it's also important that, when I was describing the firm as an institution, it's very important that, and here, you have to think about markets differently than either neoclassical economists or Marxists, who tend to think that the way that markets work in society is like that the market determines the prices, that supply and demand balance determine prices. That's not really true in most of the economy. In reality, when you look at the world, you'll notice that most of the prices you encounter don't fluctuate very much. There isn't this kind of you're not in a market where the price of groceries is rising and falling based on changes in demand and supply. What happens in reality is that in most parts of our economy are organized oligopolistically, and there are price leaders that administratively determine a price. And then all the other actors are forced to kind of deal with that price. And that's why most of the prices we encounter are relatively fixed. And markets that aren't organized in this way, financial markets, commodity markets, tend to have rapidly fluctuating prices, right, that are more based on supply and demand. And so in this model, because the investment boards are politically determining the increase in capacity in any given sector, it's very important that you have this, what I call politically mediated supply response that generates without the need for a dominating firm. It makes it possible to have administratively set prices, because basically the investment board's just deciding what the capacity is in the sector. And it makes possible a similar administrative pricing without dominant lead firms. And so there's going to be a kind of price level within any sector. There's going to be a lot of fluctuations around that price, but there's going to be a relatively determined price level that makes administrative pricing possible. And what that means is that, when firms are selling their outputs, they're going to be able to make trade-offs internally within the firm. They're going to be able to decide how to balance efficiency, sustainability, democracy, work quality. And I think part of what these firms are doing, the reason why I mention it is I think they're not only making an argument for where to go through their proposals, investment proposals, they're also making an argument about where to go through their decisions about how to balance those trade-offs internally. And so I think that when we think about the investment boards, they're going to be interacting with all these firms that are already kind of in a political conversation with one another through all these other, let's say industry kind of venues, civil society venues, all these arguments about what the correct way is to balance the different goals across society within their firm and within their sector. And that's going to be informing their debates about, what kind of proposals to make. These aren't merely technical proposals that they're bringing up. The firms are themselves part of this ongoing conversation in society about what are the values we should seek to realize through our production. And you can imagine, in manufacturing, there's going to be a lot of people who are saying, look, maybe we've conquered fossil fuels and we've moved to this, green economy. Let's imagine that happens. They might say, look, there's still all of these other goals like biodiversity, all these things that matter to us, and we want to produce less and produce better in these ways. So all these fights that are going to be happening, all these ideas and arguments for what we should be producing and how we should be producing that are going to be filtering up and throughout society in all of these different ways. And, I think the firms themselves, since somehow they're going to be, part of the workers across the firms are going to make up a substantial part of the stakeholders in the industry. They're going to be having all of these different venues where they're debating all of these questions about how to trade off our goals, what the proper ways are to move forward. It's not a conception of democracy where like democracy is every 4 years you vote and then you go home. It's this constant struggle. It's kind of like fight for what you believe in across the production realm that you are involved in. And so I think we can imagine that through all of this associative life, right? Through all of this almost like like the political organization of worker groups across all these different activities. What was the second one you mentioned?
That was the ratio in which the budget that was set aside for investment is being distributed amongst the different sectors.
Yeah. So I think the way I imagine it is sort of like, there are these really important macro decisions that we have to make in this economy. Like basically there's these divisions in the economy. There's like, what portion of our resources are going to go to universal basic services? What portion is going to go towards stuff that you're purchasing with credits, like the consumer-based economy, whether it could be 100% basic income, it could be partially basic income and work-based income, all different kinds of possibilities there. A portion of it is going to like the administrative functions of the economy. Like these investment boards are going to need technical administrations, and there's going to have to be all these technical associations as well. Part of the economy is the civil society function of like all the points that go to all the non-firm producers, like all these associations, civic, political, etc., and then part for investment. And so I imagine that, basically there could be a bunch of survey questions that people answer every year about how they want to shift the balance, and that basically like these shifts could happen. There could be drifts over time that determine the balance of points across these 5 basic divisions. You could also use sortition and have citizens' assemblies that kind of debate this and produce reports about where they think things should go. And then you could have a society-wide survey or vote or something. You could also just have a system for distributing the investment resources across investment boards. That could happen through like a survey where people are just, all the different groups on the investment boards are sort of like trying to, produce like political material. Like, we could do this. This is where we're going in healthcare. This is where we're trying to go in manufacturing. This is where we're trying to go, in childcare services. And people could just sort of say, like, we think we should give a little bit more to this or a little bit less to this. They could just be asked to people could be asked indirectly questions about how they think the world feels to them and which parts of the economy need to change the most or where they see the most possibility. And that information could just filter again into these incremental changes in the distribution of investment resources. You could alternately have a much more centralized system where there's like a Congress that's sort of more general, that people vote politically to put people on. I talk in the paper or one of the articles about how you could have proportional representation. And you could have these big votes, and you could have a Congress where it's decided in a more central political way. So you could have it would be easy to organize like a digital plebiscite that just drifts, that like shifts slowly things over time across the sectors. Or you could have you could have more, you could have citizens' assemblies versions that are more sortition based, or you could have like really political congresses deciding. I think to me, it's like you'd have to just try it out. I don't know. You'd have to try out different possibilities of thinking about that. But the important point is that however you do it, the end result would be that each sector would have a budget. It would end up with an actual kind of dollar a point amount that is its fixed budget, and then where it's trying to do that multi-criterial optimization of like finding its best options for moving forward in this political way. And I just think like it's a really fully politicized society where there's going to be all of these much more, John Stuart Mill wrote this book on liberty, and he was a socialist, actually. There's this great book, J.S. Mill, Socialist, by, I think the author's last name is McCabe, that came out a few years ago and explains like how Mill has been really maligned, like taken as a non-socialist liberal by trying to repress the fact that he wrote most of these texts with his girlfriend, who was a committed socialist. But there's this idea in Mill too that it's just like, in a socialist world where we really raise people up and people aren't struggling to survive anymore, they're going to have a lot more time and capacity to think about and care about where their world is going. And it's really important to me that in this society of the future, that everyone also have these resources, these free points, they're called, where they can use them to fund whatever kind of civic associations they want, whether it's like chess clubs or, discos that play weird music that other people don't like, or political groups, whether those are small political agitation groups or like large political parties, religious organizations, like a whole space for that. And I think that by suffusing this whole organizational, associational life, you're really imagining like a society that's much more politicized than ours in a certain sense. Like people care about all this stuff. They have resources. They're organizing around it. There aren't just a group of rich people who shape everything that happens in civil society and in politics with huge amounts of money. There's no corporations with like massive lobbying power surpluses that they're spending on politics. It's like a world where, the political space of possibility is going to be much more determined by what people, average everyday people, care about. And I think that as long as the institutions have clear rules and there's ways to change those rules and adapt them over time experimentally, that, people will be able to exist in a kind of context where they will try to fight it out within the institutions available to them. People will believe that, people will be like degrowthers or whatever. They're like, we should set fundamental limits on how much we produce, and they'll fight for that across all of these different spaces. And maybe they'll win some battles and lose others. There will be vegans, there will be accelerationists, there will be like all different kinds of people fighting it out across all these different spaces for what they believe in. And I just think, as you said, against the kind of Pat Devine and Fikret Adaman model, which has influenced me so much, we don't have to imagine that, people will ever reach agreement. There will just be sort of like the emphases of society will shift based on which kind of views are winning out at any time, and people's views will evolve over time. And some things that initially don't seem that important, like let's say, veganism. I'm not a vegan. I think it's hard to imagine a world where most people are, but maybe if we get to a better future where we treat human beings better and we care about the environment, maybe veganism will tend over time to become just a really important value where there's people really fighting for it and most people ignore them, but over time they become, a majority of society in the sectors that matter. So I just think there's in a world where people feel, what's really important from a kind of liberal socialist perspective is to get to a world where people feel okay, where they don't feel like the direction society is going to go in is like existentially threatening to them, that they're not going to be able to get what they need. I think a lot of what's happening in our society is that people feel very insecure about their own futures and their cultures. I think getting to a world where people feel fundamentally secure is the necessity for having like a form of politics that is civil in character. But within that space of civility, there can be huge disagreements. And I think we should allow for things that, won't be like we might not think are the best possible outcome, like coalitional forms of politicking, where, people are just like goals that aren't necessarily coherent together come together to fight for changes together because they can build, compromises and coalitions among themselves to push through certain changes. So it's going to be fully politicized in that way, I think, but without requiring. What's really important to me is that it's not a model of participatory democracy, where we imagine that people are going to spend all their time in politics, right? I think there's all these other ways of being political through building or funding associations, through elections, that doesn't require, like, I don't want to imagine a world where people don't get to live their lives and enjoy their lives because they are fundamentally always participating in politics. I think that's a bad image of the future, the endless meeting future that I don't want to inhabit.
Yes, the classical too many meetings problem. So, what I would be interested in is to take a bit of a closer look at the role of markets within your framework. Could you maybe explain the role of markets a bit more, and specifically with regard to what is the driver behind these forms of market exchange that you propose, since the profit motive has been eliminated? So what is then driving these exchanges? And I'm also asking myself, is there a point where it doesn't make any sense to still call it a market then?
Well, that's interesting you put it that way. So one thing that I kind of draw from neoclassical socialists like Lange, it's funny, I'm like denying the Lange Lerner Taylor direction for socialism, because I'm saying we shouldn't have this, kind of like single goal optimization models of markets as like general equilibrium models and so on. But what I think is, and I actually think it's important that a dynamic economy and a politicized economy like what I'm discussing will generate a lot of waste. And I think that neoclassical economics has misled us because it often emphasizes getting to a world with no waste. But in the neoclassical model, it's a fully static world. It's a world without change. That's the only way you can eliminate waste. If you have innovation and you have struggles to figure out what possible futures are going to happen, even in capitalism, that means that you're going to waste tons of resources. You're going to have underproduction in certain activities, overproduction in others, as we're trying to like find our way forward across all these possibilities. So I think we overstate the goal of static allocative efficiency over the desire for dynamism. This is like Schumpeter's critique, the creative destruction dimension. There's going to be creative destruction in socialism because we don't know what futures we want to inhabit, and we don't know always what the outcomes will be or the pace of technological progress, et cetera. But so what role do markets play? I think that, on the consumer side, I remember what I was going to say. I was going to tell you that when it comes to Lange, what he said that's really important is that we should think of markets more like consumer markets than the way we think of how capitalists act in markets. Because in a consumer market, the fundamental point about a market is that you have a certain budget and you face a set of priced alternatives. And your budget constrains what you can spend, and you have to spend it across these different options. There's a lot of really interesting work, like Anwar Sheikh talks about this in his book on capitalism, that you can get a lot of the basic features of markets to function without needing to think of the actors within those markets as like utility maximizing rational actors. All you really need to get markets to work in a lot of the ways we expect is just to have this budget constraint. However people are interacting with that budget constraint, the fact that they only have so much and not more is what allows markets to start to organize themselves in these like rational and coherent ways. So we're thinking about, people just spending across priced alternatives, not about the idea that they're acting in markets to try to generate a maximal surplus, that they're trying to spend in a way where they, have as much left over that they haven't spent as possible. When we think of consumers, it's more this mode of like, how do I spend my full budget across my options? And I take that version of markets across, bring it also into thinking about the producer realm. Now, on the consumer side, you could have any degree of marketization. You could have a society that produces all of its consumer goods as universal, free, basic services. I think you probably wouldn't want to do that. You'd want to have consumer markets where people have choice across different alternatives. Some people want to have bigger houses farther from city centers. Some people want to be in the middle of the action and are willing to, give up other things to have those. A big problem with the way markets work from the consumer side in our society has to do with how high inequality is. Like some people in a consumer market make no sacrifices at all because they just have millions and millions of dollars, and other people are struggling to survive. In a future world, I don't think we need to have full equality of credits, but with a much lower level of consumer credit inequality, markets could function to allow people to make choices, more vacations versus more stuff, whatever. The point is that however much markets exist in the consumer realm, you need markets in the producer realm because you have to allow people, and this also comes from Pat's work. You have to allow those producers to choose their suppliers. They have to be able to decide, we want to get our stuff from these people, not these people. And that has to do, again, with what I said earlier, this implementation problem in centrally planned socialism, that for reasons of quality control and also due to the vintage problem, and just for flexibility and innovation, unexpected kind of hiccups and bottlenecks in production, you want producers to be able to have the freedom to choose across the suppliers they actually want to interact with. And so in this model, because of, the way that the credits points division works, and because there's politically mediated supply responses, what we're going to have are a kind of administered price system where prices in each sector are going to be set in some way because, you can't simply say like, oh, there's, I don't know, what would be an example? Like, I don't know, some widget production. There's no way that an individual capitalist can say, hey, I see this possibility in the widget market. I'm going to enter that market, expand production, use a lower price to kind of like intervene in and defeat competitors in that market. So these are relatively stable markets because of this political mediation of supply response. There's like a limited amount of capacity in the market that producers can depend on. And that means that they can administratively set prices at a certain level. If the investment board thinks that, that they are being like lazy or whatever, they can threaten to like introduce more, the investment board has the capacity to increase supply in the sector, create new firms, shake things up, whatever. And we could talk about what that looks like. But basically, producers face this kind of administrative prices, so they can set their prices. They have a certain amount of capacity, and they just have to produce in such a way that they spend their whole budgets. Now, okay, like what does that look like in practice? Well, I say the producers have to follow 3 rules. They have to balance their incomes and outflows of points. So they have to, they have to only spend what they receive in points. They have to try to get to normal capacity utilization, which is actually most in our economy, profitability is mostly a measure of capacity utilization because in a capitalist economy today, there's giant overhead costs in production. And so what determines the profit rate at any given moment is the volume of production, how close the firm is to using its capacity in normal ways. Is it using too much of its capacity? Then it's going to have a high profit rate and it's going to be encouraged to invest more. If it's not using it, it's going to have a low profit rate. It's going to be encouraged to disinvest. So in this economy, we don't have profitability. We just have, using one's full budget, producing in a way that fits with normal capacity utilization. And then this third rule that's a little bit more fuzzy, which is like, as you're making these trade-offs across the goals that we have for our sector, so efficient production, sustainability, work quality, and so on, within that feasible space of what you could choose, are you choosing in a way that sort of like maintains coherence across the sector? So the point is that there are these evaluation committees that are kind of evaluating firms and deciding whether they're producing in the right way. But basically, these firms are just setting their prices. Different firms get points in different ways. If it's a hospital, they just receive like an administrative determination of like, you're serving this many people. This is the points available for your hospital. Spend them as you need to across these goals. But if you're an intermediate producer, you need to set your price in such a way that you're going to sell enough to use your resources in a normal way. Let's say, I don't know, 85% capacity utilization. And that will then give you a certain budget that you spend across all your different goals, work quality, et cetera, efficient production, whatever it is. And you're just going to be evaluated. You have a lot of freedom to make those trade-offs, but you're going to be evaluated for you're going to be encouraged to make those trade-offs in a way that's coherent for the sector. Sorry, it's so complicated. I'm sure you have many questions, but it's still a market. It's still a market, but it doesn't function the same way because there's no reason or possibility of acting in that market to generate surpluses. Like as a producer, you never have a goal of of having points left over, because that would mean you just didn't fully spend your budget on all the different goals you could pursue. There's no point in having anything left over because you can't take the leftover and either distribute that to yourselves as income or use it for investment. And a further point I didn't say is that unused points start to lose value and disappear. So you have to be using them to meet your various goals. Yeah, that's like a starting point. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, so let's make it more conversational.
Well, I mean, the basic question is still, what is the driver behind it then? Because you don't have profit. Prices are mostly, if not completely, but mostly set at least within a very tight corridor, as I understand it.
Yeah.
You have what you call an evaluation committee, which basically looks at your enterprise and decides whether or not you're doing the job right, So there, more or less, yeah. So there is a very, very tight corridor within which you can actually make these different decisions. And since there is, as you rightly pointed out, since there isn't any profit motive because you cannot actually accrue any profit, what then is the driver behind these decisions? So what is the momentum, the thing that makes the engine run, so to speak? And I think this is quite closely related to the question of the role of competition within this framework, because these enterprises, they obviously don't have to compete for profits. They do compete for market share, exactly. So there is this sort of pressure coming from that side of things, because if you don't produce in a way that is attractive enough for people to basically buy your goods, then you will exit the market at some point. I mean, you have very social mechanisms that first try to help you gain a bit more productive efficiency or solve these problems in other ways. But at some point, there are, one might call, hard budget constraints, and that is quite important for your model, I think. So what would you say? Is this then the driving force behind the whole thing, that people compete for market share, and that is kind of what pushes the individual enterprise into, first of all, competition of some sort, and then through that into a form of optimizing, even though optimizing along a multi-criterial perspective? Is that right?
I see. So I think you're asking two questions that we should tease apart. You're asking multiple questions, but there's two genres of question. Because one is actually like motivation, like a motivational question. So what motivates actors within the system? And I have a lot to say about that. But the other question is sort of like, are the rules such that they generate kind of coherence? Will actors sort of like be able to, will they be able to do what they're supposed to do and the whole thing works? Because I think that, for example, like, it's very important to me that these actors within the firms, that there are hard budget constraints, that the point of balancing points is like, either you're getting these from an administrative, like, distribution, like you're a hospital, you're doing universal basic services. So you're not selling anything, right? You're just serving a community and you get that budget, and you have to make sure that you don't spend more than you receive. So you have this hard budget constraint. There's maybe like credit facilities, but if you're overspending your budget, you're falling into this danger zone where you're going to lose your autonomy, right? But if you're a producer producing intermediate inputs or selling to consumer markets, you're going to have to earn enough to cover your costs. And many of your costs are going to be fixed, right? You're going to have to pay rental charges. Like, when you use labor, you have to pay for that labor in points. And then the workers, you pay for their use in points. They get a credit income. You have to pay for the land, rent on the land. You have to pay a capital charge for the capital use. You have a lot of overhead costs, fixed costs. And then you have your variable costs that come from your intermediate inputs you need to gather. So you have to sell enough to cover your costs, right? So you have a market in that sense. And if you're producing bad quality stuff, people are going to not buy from you. And then you're not going to be able to, cover your costs. You're going to end up failing at the level of the hard budget constraint, and you're going to be flagged as a non-viable organization. And so, that budget constraint rule is very important. It's also possible that, your firm is doing really well and people are coming to you, you're gaining market share, right? And you end up with all of these additional points that kind of put you, if not in a surplus, just show that, people are moving towards you. And that is also something at the sectoral level to take account of. So there is a kind of competition. It's a bit more like competition in the idealized kind of like models of the neoclassicals. It's like, it's competition for like, that's trying to achieve balance across firms, not this creative destruction of firms trying to like overcome each other. But it gives really important information to society. And it's very important that if you're not doing a good job at some basic level, this does function as a form of, of discipline. That if you're producing stuff no one needs or wants and you can't make your budget, you're going to, as I said, go into receivership. You're going to lose firm autonomy, a kind of not an evaluative committee. These are all stakeholder committees. So, an evaluative committee could judge like that you're not doing a good job, drawn sortition based, just randomly selection from stakeholders. The receivership committee would be another like stakeholder based group that would come in and say, hey, can we get you back up to speed, or does this firm need to go away to be, scrapped for parts? But I think that there's a basic level of motivation that, firms are going to want to follow these rules so that they have the freedom of action to participate in the economy in a full way, right? Like you have to be producing stuff people want and, operating at normal capacity utilization and operating in this feasibility space of the trade-offs across the goals. As long as you're doing that, you get to participate in this whole, you don't have to worry about the economic dimension of what you're doing. You can focus on serving your purpose within society, whether it's making bicycles or caring for children or for the sick or inventing things, right? Like the idea here is that, it's almost like the rules are more like satisficing rules. It's like, you need to make sure you do at least this, because if you do that, you get to participate in this economy where you can generate a lot of meaning in your life. You can show that you're useful. That comes to the motivation side of it, right? Like these are just the baselines that let you, as long as you're doing that, you can kind of ignore the economic stuff and focus on the purpose of what you're doing, whatever that happens to be. And I think it's really important from a motivational perspective that, there's all these studies of motivation. People aren't, the idea that you can only motivate people by the idea like, oh, well, if you do this, you can make a lot of money. I think that doesn't even fit with current research on motivation, right? The idea here is, produce in this economically viable way, and then you can freely like focus on what the goal is of your work. And part of what's really important here is if you're running a hospital, your goal is to take care of sick people, but it's also to make sure that the nurses and the doctors and the clerical workers and the janitors, that they all feel good about their work, that this is like a positive work environment, that you're producing sustainably. So as long as you are satisficing and like meet these basic requirements of the economy, you as an institution, whether you're making a bicycle or running a hospital, you can focus on what actually matters in that and how to handle the trade-offs that inevitably emerge in that space, like making better working conditions for your workers at the hospital might have consequences for other goals that you also have, and you have a limited budget. And so there's going to be a debate inside the hospital how to do that. You're making bicycles. Again, you only have a certain budget available to you to do that. And so you have to decide how to make those decisions across the goals. I think that this way of thinking, it really, in capitalism, the purpose of the firm is to produce a profit. And if it meets these other goals along the way, maybe it'll function better. But in this society, it's like, these are the baselines. And if you do those things, then, you get to focus on actually doing what you're doing. Mm. Everything that happens in this economy on the firm side should actually serve a social purpose. And I think people feel good when they're able to do that. And I don't know, it comes also, we could talk about a lot of the problems with worker-managed firms in capitalism, which require firms to make these impossible trade-offs between, do we use our operating surplus to pay ourselves out, or do we use our operating surplus to invest in the future of the firm? In this context, these worker-managed firms, all they have to do is meet these basic requirements. And as long as they do that, they're free from the kinds of agonizing decisions that have really deformed worker-managed firms in our society. They don't have to try to generate a surplus or decide how that surplus is going to be used. All of those decisions are made outside of their realm of activity. And so they can just focus on serving their purpose well. If they fail to do it, then they go into receivership. They might, if they do it through negligence, they're going to lose their incomes. There is a kind of pressure to get to this bar, right? To use your resources. If you're not doing that, then it implies that, society should use those resources differently. Society is giving you these resources to serve a purpose. And if you're not meeting the basic standard, then, society can say, hey, we want to give these to someone else if you can't make this work. But it functions as a baseline. Part of the issue here is that, if firms are tending to, if there are these market share changes, then the investment board has to consider that in deciding how and where to invest, right? And I talk here, and this is also drawn from Pat's work, the idea is that, the investment board in some ways is actually like the head of a corporation with different divisions. You can think of each of the firms within the sector as different divisions, and they are, they're in the case of a corporation, what the head, C-suite is looking at are the different profitabilities of the different divisions, and trying to figure out, is this division making more money because they've innovated, or is it making more money because of a windfall? Should we actually invest more here, or should we not invest? Is this division falling behind because they've innovated and come up with something really exciting, and they just need more time to figure it out? Or are they falling behind because they're not doing something useful and we should spin off or close the division? In the same way, the investment board is going to have to look at changes in market share across the firms and try to figure out what that means. There's no direct, obvious meaning to what that is. In some cases, the change in market share is just really good information. This firm is just doing a bad job, and needs to go into receivership or be eliminated. But if a firm is doing well, there could be many reasons why that firm does well. There could be some innovation that the firm has made where it's like, okay, now we need to generalize this innovation across the sector, and then the market shares will repair themselves, go back to status quo ante, right? Like, these guys have come up with this great way to, make a bicycle. Now everyone's buying it. So we should take this innovation we've approved and fast track it and say everyone else in the sector can also make this innovation and restore the status quo ante. If a firm is doing really well because of some particular thing about that firm that other firms can't take on, then the firm should be advised to raise its price to sort of become a higher end of the market, because you can't generalize it, right? Like, they're just a special producer. They're a baker who makes bread better than anyone else, and there's no way to kind of get that to go to the other bakeries. So, you say to that firm, look, you're currently you're making more, you have a higher market share because you're not operating at normal capacity utilization anymore. Instead of 85%, you're running hot. Your workers are working really hard. Like, the only way to make this work would be to expand your production at the expense of others. But we don't think that's worthwhile in this case. So you should just differentiate yourself by price rise to get back, because all the firms are trying to operate at normal capacity utilization. So if you're over that, then you need to raise your price to get back to it, essentially, unless the investment board's willing to expand your firm at the expense of others. A third possibility is like you're doing really well because you're sacrificing goals that really matter to society. In that case, we definitely shouldn't invest in you anymore. We should tell you, like, stop producing in that way, or you're going to go into receivership. You need to kind of return to the feasible space of what we think is a worthwhile set of trade-offs. So yeah, it's very important. I mean, I'm describing it in a way like it's very hard to keep all the pieces in place, but it is really important that there are these hard budget constraints, and that when firms don't act on those, or when their capacity utilization either falls too low or rises too high, there are consequences for those things that are handled by these different parts of the system. But I think it's very important that firms are subject to these hard constraints and objective evaluations, and that, firms that aren't doing well are, winnowed out and replaced or helped back to health. And that firms that, are doing especially well, that there's an investigation of why that is.
What I really liked about the proposal is that you try to implement these structural breaks into the framework, and we touched upon a couple of them already. There's no profit motive, of course. And you mentioned in the beginning this structural separation between points and credits. And I was asking myself, how does the introduction of these currencies relate to the question of incommensurability that you write about in the first part of your 2-essay series? While there is no universal unit of account, one could argue that the production points act as if there was a form of commensurability between the different factors of production, while at the same time there is actually none, So will you agree that there is a form of kind of forced commensurability with regard to these points?
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting question, because it could be a kind of scandalous dimension of the proposal I'm making for the reason that you say, right? So my read of efforts to implement a Neurathian kind of perspective, right? To take the insights of Otto Neurath and kind of find a way to realize them in the world. My version of that is to say that we need to think in terms of costs and benefits differently. And my idea is that we can have commensurability of costs. So we can say, there's different we only have so many resources, and we're deciding how to use those resources to do all the different kinds of things that we want to do in society. But there should be incommensurability of benefits, right? So it's sort of like the goals that we have for society are themselves sought for their own sake. They're partially non-compensatory. So we can't make up for a loss of sustainability with a gain in income. Like, there's just different ways of composing our goals, realizing a world that has these different elements to it. And that's what allows me to, I think there's a lot of reasons to be careful about or critical about that, what I'm saying. I think it's like something to talk about a lot. But the effect of it is that it breaks the possibility of cost-benefit analysis in the kind of standard way that people think about in capitalism, because the benefits have no unit of account that can be commensurated across them, but the costs do. So you can still think about, for example, like, let's say there's an investment proposal, right, that is saying, we're going to make these buildings easier to clean so that the custodial staff that works in all these spaces is going to have a more satisfying work. Well, there's a cost of that investment. Like, we're going to have to bring in all of these specialized forms of labor. We're going to have to acquire these materials. We're going to have to draw up designs and implement them. Like, there's all these costs associated with that. But the benefit is not a monetary benefit. The benefit is that there's something that's going to get better in the world, right? And we're not commensurating that benefit with other benefits. We're not saying like, improving the health and well-being of custodians is like, has a certain amount of utility to it that we can assign a dollar value to and then compare it to other things we could do that are good for the environment or good for beauty or good for efficiency. And to me, this is very important because it allows us to construct an economy in a sense. It allows us to say we have a certain amount of resources and, realizing different benefits is going to have costs that we can't, we have to draw resources away that could have alternative uses. I think this way of breaking apart the incommensurability problem and separating incommensurabilities of benefit from commensurabilities of cost is the way to do that. The credits points distinction lets me do that because there's no longer any reason to evaluate an investment proposal by saying, hey, this is going to generate this much income, or just anything in society. There's no prioritization given to the kind of like the income, like as I described before, the way that maximizing a monetary surplus makes efficiency the primary goal. Here, the separations of credits from points, we're just spending these points to achieve a variety of different goals. So yeah, you can come back at me and tell me what you think about that. I mean, it is really interesting. Like when you assign these rental charges to land, labor, and capital. Like basically the way this economy works at the macro level is like, somehow there's this initial distribution of points to all these different actors in society, and then they're going to start spending them. And they're either going to spend them on rental charges or intermediate inputs. So you have to pay a certain cost for using labor, a certain cost for using land, and a certain cost for using instruments of production. And we can talk about, how those are determined internally, like labor, how labor rental charges differentiate. You can talk about, the depreciation of capital and like how that's measured over time. But basically, there is this way that you're going to be deciding. So as firms are spending, they're spending on rental charges and they're spending on intermediate inputs. The firms that any spending on rental charges is removed from the system, any spending on intermediate inputs passes to the next producer. They spend on rental charges and on intermediate inputs. The parts that goes to intermediate input pass down, and eventually all spending of points will leave the system as rental charge payments, and some will disappear due to just not being spent. I said they have this kind of time they lose over time. What's an interesting feature of that is that, in a way, like in capitalism, we could think about how like income is distributed to these different factors of production, like a certain, the labor share, the capital share, let's say. Here too, this is an income base. It's an administrative feature of the system that in the end, a certain amount of points are going to go to pay for labor, a certain portion of points are going to go to pay for land, and a certain portion of points are going to go to pay for capital. And how you balance across those, like how society decides the relative cost of spending on labor inputs versus capital inputs versus land inputs. If you assume you don't have to be this is so deep cuts, I'm sorry, but maybe some people will understand what I'm talking about. You don't have to assume like Cobb-Douglas production functions where like, you can produce anything you want with any combination of labor and capital. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like in neoclassical economics, you can produce bread with a lot of bakers and a little flour, or a ton of flour and very few bakers. There's this kind of abstract model where there's full substitutability across capital and labor. You can imagine some degree of substitutability across these factors of production, that sometimes we can produce stuff with more capital, other times with more labor. How you cost those is going to determine whether your economy becomes relatively labor intensive, relatively land intensive, relatively capital intensive. So there are big social consequences for how these rental charges are set, and in that sense commensurating across factors of production, like you say. I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think it's like a decision society would have to make at the social level that it could change over time, but it's very hard to explain to people right now why that would be important. I think in practice, people would realize that it does matter how we choose to commensurate these different factors of production. I'm not as worried about it because I think that a lot of the concerns people raise around commensuration when it comes to costs are things like externalities. They're like, well, if we cost land in a certain way, it could lead to overuse of land. It could have all these consequences. You can't price in all of these things. We don't know the long-term blah, blah, blah. There's all these reasons people are very concerned about attaching monetary costs to different factors of production. For me, what's really important is I think that I'm describing an economy without externalities, because anything you could describe as something that matters to us that isn't included in the price is basically you're describing a goal of the society. You're describing something that matters to society. Like if we're pricing something in a way that is leading to a loss of biodiversity, well, biodiversity is a value that matters to us. And then it should come in. If it matters to us, really, it will come in and it will shape at the benefit level what we choose to do with our resources. And that will filter through and affect in different ways also the system of relative prices. But I think it's very important that most of the things that people talk about as externalities, they imagine will be included primarily at the level of like internalizing externalities at the level of cost. But for me, it's more important to think about internalizing externalities at the level of benefits, that anything that matters to us becomes a goal of our economy. And in that sense, directly shapes what we do. This also relates to this thing. I don't know if this is getting too complicated, but it really relates to this point about, whether we can get society to take goals seriously simply by putting them into the prices, by like pricing externalities. I think you can't do that. I think you can only, like sustainability will only really function as a goal if it's not merely this idea that we include sustainability in the price and try to incentivize people to do the right thing. That will lead to gaming of metrics. It will lead to all kinds of perverse outcomes that people don't expect. You have to actually fight for people to care about sustainability. They have to actually have it as a goal that's organizing production. And then people will start to innovate. They'll start to change how and what they produce in order to generate this benefit in society. And at that level, you'll solve the kind of problems that people worry about with commensuration. So that's my defense of my scandalous position around these issues. So,
well, I'm sure that it's not scandalous for everybody. I'm still trying to get the underlying sense of it, I guess, because the more important part would be that the prices in production points, they are supposed to lead decisions in some way, shape or form. And of course you have overarching goals within society that are deliberated through different means, through other means than these prices, but these prices are supposed to function as a coordinating mechanism within this framework of an economy. And as such, it makes a difference whether or not the points are acting as a fungible information point, let's say, and thereby making underlying material conditions fungible and thereby comparable in a way that an in natura calculation wouldn't, So there's a form of translation happening that happens regardless from the question whether or not we are talking about comparing different goals or comparing different production methods, whatever. There is this aspect of making something, a material layer, artificially commensurable through a price. And then the question is not only, does it then still communicate a certain type of information that it initially wanted to communicate, but also the question pops up how these prices come about. So what is the mechanism through which it is being decided that a given input has this price? And as you indicate, these are mostly administered prices that I guess also react with consumer markets in the credit system. And so all of these questions pop up. What then is the relation between the credits and the points? So I think you argue that there is a form of proportionality at place between these different units. And all of these questions pop up with regard to how do prices come about, and what does this mean in this whole complex regarding the question of commensurability or incommensurability, and whether or not a production point, is able to kind of fulfill the task that you wanted to fulfill within this framework of an alternative economy, I guess.
So
we're really nerdy here now.
That's great, though.
But it's good. No,
yeah. So I think at some level, just in regard to the last thing you said, as I said, like there is this problem of there's a political decision that will determine the degree to which the economy is tending towards being labor intensive or capital or land intensive. That has to do with like, when we're making these rental charges and we're saying, okay, you have to pay for the labor you use, the land you use, the capital you use. By sort of varying those rental charges, we will encourage people to make decisions, that by commensurating those in different ways at the social level, we're going to encourage a different kind of economy to come about. If we make capital very expensive to use, people will tend to think, oh, when we produce, we should focus on labor, let's say. We probably wouldn't want that, right? We probably want like an economy, most people will say, that's like somewhat more capital intensive and less land and labor intensive. But at the larger level of like how our prices determined and what it means to have administrative or administered prices, what it means for me is not that there's some like, it doesn't mean that there's some body as a whole that's determining the prices, like some algorithm that does that. What it means is that you have what I call politically mediated supply responses. So let's say you're in the manufacturing sector. Demand could rise for, let's say, cars, and so you could have a situation where car producers are tending to run at high capacity utilization. Let's say we've set the normal utilization at 85%, but there's just a really high demand for cars. And now it's rising, it's going to 90, 95. And the car producers are like, look, we're being overworked. Like, you need to, we need more cars. And they're in the manufacturing sector and they're saying, hey, we want to expand. Like, we're making investment proposals that the goal is not to improve sustainability, whatever. It's just, we want to produce more. We want to expand our facilities, want to build another factory or have another firm. The investment board might say, well, we don't care. We don't want more cars in the society. We've maxed out. Like, we don't want any more cars on the road. If people want those, we're going to try to make more trains and we're going to make more of this and that. We're going to try to find other ways of solving this, but we're not making more cars. Then the producers of cars have to just raise their prices to get back to normal capacity utilization. So administered prices doesn't mean centrally planned prices. It just means that because the supply response is constrained, producers have a high degree of autonomy in deciding what price to set things at in order to be able to utilize their capacity normally, because the total amount of capacity in the line is going to be constrained by this action. In a capitalist economy, as I said, there's a kind of version of this because the lead producer is able, through their regulative functions, through their massive economies of scale, to kind of enforce gentlemanly competition among the firms in their industry and sort of create this space where, prices are all falling in this relatively stable place. They're not varying very much. When a new producer comes in from the outside, like let's say Toyota is like, hey, we can break into the car market, they're going to disrupt that regulative function and try to intervene by entering the market, creating all this additional supply, pushing down their price to defeat the current lead capitalist. So you have this whole kind of like way that in the real world of capitalism, administered prices are both sort of like enforced by lead actors and then periodically contested by the entrance of other actors. In this system, you don't have that fight for domination because the investment board itself is politically constraining entry into the field. And they're deciding whether to increase production or to say, right now, we're going to take all these investment proposals that improve production in various ways, but we're not taking proposals that increase the volume of production. Those are really essential decisions that will shape what happens in every sector of the economy. maybe there's certain things where it's like it's not socially bad to increase production, and there's a lot of interest across producers and consumers and social groups to increase the volume of production in certain activities. But decisions about what the capacity level should be in each industry are ultimately going to determine what the price is in that industry. I mean, it's relative to technological capacities and so on. But basically, demand is going to vary based on whatever demand varies with, but the supply response to demand is politically constrained. And that's what sets up the whole, that's what's going to determine transformations in the price levels over time. So, you could have all kinds of innovations at all different levels within every one of these sectors. But the one that's going to determine where the price falls is decisions about increasing or decreasing capacity. We can have a dangerous chemical that makes the world worse. And people could say, look, we have to wind down production of this thing. It's bad for society. We want to be removing and not even replacing existing capacity in this as it wears out, or even more quickly, like in fossil fuels. We want to strand and then just pull apart this production, and that's going to cause the price to rise because producers are going to be trying to get to normal capacity utilization as capacity in the sector changes relative to demand. So I don't know if that's helping you understand how prices are going to be determined by the supply response to demand. But because supply is politically constrained in the system, that's also how a lot of these other goals can enter, and they will shape relative prices. Like there will be more production of things that are socially useful, and that will make it cheaper. And there will be less production of things that it has socially negative consequences. And if there's breakthroughs, let's say, there are things that are very unsustainable to produce. And so there's really strong limits on what people are willing to produce. And there's some breakthrough that makes it fine. Like they solve technologically the problem of why we don't want to produce more of this thing. I don't know, aerosols. There's some form that isn't damaging anymore. Then, we can say, hey, actually, this isn't bad anymore. Let's ramp up production of this thing and cause the price to fall. It doesn't have to come, at the expense of existing producers. They could be expanding, or the investment board could say, hey, let's just create additional firms that fulfill this additional demand. But it's really the way I think about it, if you want to think about it more philosophically, is like Adam Smith talks about this idea that the price system is determined by how supply responds to demand across the economy. But then he says there's certain parts of the economy that never equalize. And he gives the example of like innkeepers. He's like, people just like to be innkeepers. There's just something nice about keeping it in. And so even though there's oversupply of innkeepers, the price, people don't leave the line. Supply doesn't respond to limited demand by leaving, because people just like to be innkeepers, and it warps the price system. Like this added entry and added exit from different activities warps the relative price system around these other non-economic factors. And what I'm describing is a system where it's not that the price fabric is warped at certain points by non-economic considerations. It's that warping has become total. Relative prices are at every level determined by all of these non-economic factors. Supply response is constrained, is politically determined throughout the system. And so that warping effect of non-economic values is going to be total throughout the system. And it's going to shape, through shaping supply response, it's going to determine, what are the prices at which producers can cover their budgets and achieve normal capacity utilization, if that makes sense. So that's, yeah.
Since you mentioned non-economic factors, I guess the way that we talked about it so far is pretty much within the realm of what one might call democratic economic planning, even though in a highly politicized manner, of course, which is highly desirable. But there's also an ongoing debate around questions of care and reproduction with regard to this question of democratic planning in a larger perspective. How does this factor into your framework? How do you think about these fields with regard to the framework that you bring about, that you propose?
I think that's really great that people are paying more attention to that. And certainly, I think if we look back to the 80s, 90s models, we would see that they it's not that they don't deal with the question. I think Paracon and the Cockshott and Cottrell models, they try to include care in different ways, but highly politically different ways of thinking about those issues. And I'm very open here to different ways of thinking about what it means to include care. I mean, I think that on the one hand, the point is just that a lot of things that are currently left to individual households to deal with in a marketized way would be taken over by universal basic services. And these need not be basic, That could be, we could invest more in them. We could give them more resources. They could be quite luxurious universal services that could handle a lot of care functions. You could have people, doing essential care work at home. Like maybe there's a family member they have who's disabled or elderly, and you could have a distributed system of occupational work where people are paid for that activity rather than doing other activity. I think something that people sometimes raise as an issue is this idea that having salaried labor at all is like quite bad from a care perspective or something like that. That the existence of sort of paid work differentiates like between what is what is socially valuable and what isn't, and that it devalorizes a lot of activity that we should see as valuable. Personally, I don't think that is necessary. I think that for example, like we can have a basic income that everyone receives, and that basic income could be topped up if you have small children or if you're unable to do other kinds of work for other reasons. Like society could say, hey, these are the rough equivalences that we see, and we can have a political debate over what those should be, how much you should be paid for these different kinds of activities. But I live in America, and I am around, a lot of parents who I think like spend too much time with their kids, honestly. Like they are consuming their children. Like they're actually treating their children like consumption objects rather than like human beings who need to learn to be independent. And I don't think that, I think society should say, look, this is what we socially think is kind of like, the pay of having kids. If you want to consume your children, like if you want to spend a lot more time, I consume them like I that's just how I think of it. Like, they're treating their children not like human beings who need to be raised, but like a television, like something to enjoy for themselves. That's like your problem, you can do whatever you want in your free time. It's not necessarily good for your kids to treat them that way, but it's like, these are political things we can decide about, but I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with having paid work and unpaid activities and trying to decide how to balance those things, how to decide like, you know, this person isn't working because they're taking care of someone at home. This is a form of work that society thinks should be given an additional credit income, versus other activities that are just what you do, on your free time, or what you think is important, or what your passions that you orient around. There's going to be a lot of activity in the society that's really socially valorized, but doesn't receive any kind of income. So, a big part of the society is like, I said, like this points economy that's oriented around what I call free points, associational life, the formation of all of these organizations that interact with the economy, printing presses, political parties, religious organizations. There's just going to be tons of activity people are engaging in that doesn't receive any kind of salary or payment. So there's going to be all of these social worlds where people are pursuing all of this activity that is unpaid but socially valorized. And I think we just need to make sure as a society that the care activities people do that really need to be paid, to be thought of as that, get it. And that society provides all of these kinds of, that it provides for care, that it takes care as one of its essential values. And however that should shape the production system, people are going to debate about what that should look like, right? Like maybe taking care into account means that we should produce less and have more free time. that we care for each other. Maybe having care means like a certain organization of production that allows for more time that people are away from production to involve themselves with all these different people that matter to them in their lives. So I think that just like sustainability and community and all these things can become goals that shape how the production system is organized, I would see care as one of those goals as well. And we would recognize that with care, as with other things, people are going to have really different ideas about that. The meaning of care, right? What it should look like and how it should be integrated into the organization of the production system is going to be different. Maybe societies that have these strong views about whether having a work-based income at all is a negative thing, they could just have a world where there's only universal services and a social wage that's the same for everyone or determined in some other way. There's no necessity in the system for work-based income, but I guess what I'm bristling against is I don't believe that having a work-based income itself means that we can't have an economy that incorporates care into it. So that's the only thing that I guess I'm saying.
Yeah, right. But I mean, I guess the point would be that if we have a work-based income or a society that has a work-based income, then necessarily reproductive work would have to be considered exactly that, reproductive work, I guess. I mean, that's the argument, no? Yeah. So that's what you're saying,
yeah,
right?
That we could pay that work, right? We could pay that work, but society would decide in a politicized way what that work is and how it should be paid, right?
Yeah.
Like there's not just as with everything else, there isn't just some sort of like objective measure that says what the wage should be of caring for young children or up to what age or whatever. Those are all political questions that would have to be decided politically. And those who think it's really important would have to fight to transform the world and change people's values so that those things are considered very important. It's the same with all these other things. Like I think you can imagine a future in which, I would think like reparations are really important, that there's parts of society that are just underinvested in, under-resourced for reasons of historical injustice and racism, et cetera. But, that's going to be how important reparations should be and how we should handle it is going to be a political question. And those who think it's really important, that it should shape what we produce in a big way, are going to have to fight politically for that value to kind of like become more important in society. And that will determine what share of resources or how our production system is reshaped by the need for reparations. To me, reparations also includes things that a lot of feminists care about. Like, for example, our health system is so much based on like male bodies, like there's all of these features of, there are jobs where, that have historically been jobs that are more held by women, where I think there's underinvestments in like developing the skills of those workers and making those jobs more satisfying for the people involved in them. So you can imagine all of these different ways that like as people fight for these values, as values rise to the front, and people are saying, hey, we need to build a world that takes more account of these things, then, that will shape what happens, but it'll always be political. People will have to struggle over what that is. And they'll similarly have to struggle over the level of this, like in addition to a basic income everyone receives, whatever level that is, some additional income that's paid to individuals who are caring for young children at home or caring for a disabled family member or someone elderly. Presumably, there's also going to be social facilities for all these things, childcare, universal childcare facilities, elder care. These are all going to be sectors of the economy. But in addition to that stuff, I think what's really important to recognize is that some of this work will be carried out by individuals in their households, and that work should be remunerated.
And would you say that because, another argument could be to say that the overall structure of the proposal that you bring forward has a certain maybe conservative element, in big quotation marks, conservative element to it, in the sense that it is largely focused on these classical structures where you have firms and they are the workplace vis-a-vis households and they are the sphere of reproduction. So it kind of upholds a certain separation of spheres that could be thought about differently as well. Or if one doesn't argue that these spheres should be dissoluted or dissolved completely, that at least these intersections or the way that these different spheres relate to each other, that this would have to be thought about really structurally different. I think Nancy Fraser calls this boundary work, if I'm not mistaken. So there could be an argument be made, I guess, that there is sort of a structural conservative element to the framework in that regard. What do you think about that?
I think that that's because we didn't talk as much about the associational realm, because it's very important that, in the model, a major sector of the economy consists of these non-firm producers, that are producing, because again, like here, when we think about production, we're not thinking about it in the way economies are thought of. Economies are about producing goods and services. And the question is how we produce those goods and services. Here, the economy is producing many benefits, right? It's already been broken. The boundary of the economy has been broken in the sense that the economy has been politicized, and in the sense that the goals of economic production is not, Milton Friedman had this famous line, like the social responsibility of the firm is to produce a profit. And in many models of socialism, the social responsibility of the firm is just to meet its production targets, and it's similarly a very economic conception of the economy. In a technical sense, by talking about a multi-criterial economy, we're already breaking that conception that the economy is about efficiency. The economy has to serve many different goals, and all those goals suffusing it makes it a much more, like, the boundaries do become blurred in many ways, even if it's true that we have households and we have firms. But I think that the associations are very important here, because there could be many activities that are also, like, there's many productive activities that could be happening in that realm. Like, for example, I think a big problem in thinking about economics is, like, let's say a religious organization, like a church or a mosque or a synagogue. These require a lot of funds to run, right? They collect dues. They have all different ways of acquiring financial resources and then spending money. They're economic actors. Political parties are economic actors. What is the output of these associations, right? It's like, well, their output is, I don't know, spirituality or political change or whatever it is that you think, right? Like, all of these different actors in society are producing outputs that are not merely economic in character, and even when they are economic, they're suffused by all of these other values and goals. In this society, anything, not anything, but many things that would be produced by firms could also be produced by associations in this kind of free way, and society would have to decide how the interfaces between those different activities take place. Like, for example, you could have alternative schools or childcare that's operating in this free associational space that's quite different from what's happening in the traditional part of the economy. There's all these interlinkages because they're all part of the points economy. They're all sharing a base of resources, but they're using them differently. The big thing is that associations can't hire labor. And so they remain really associational. They don't generate an income, but they can generate all kinds of other things in that. And yeah, so I think that maybe, I guess at the level of, like, household production, like households as producers, maybe that's a part of the economy where there is a boundary there that's important. But it is actually really important to me, because I think we don't want households investing in production. We want to make sure that the income they get in credits doesn't allow them to gain social power in different ways. And so I think that boundary is very important. I think that you want a world where some people make more than others, because I think some work is just requires more sacrifices than others. Like if society needs underwater welders, there's jobs that are just harder or require us to be away from our loved ones for longer periods of time. There's all kinds of reasons why some work might need to be paid more than other work. But if the credits you receive can only be used to purchase consumption goods, then the main outcome of that difference is like you see someone drinking a really nice bottle of wine and you can say, hey, they probably did something great for society to have this additional income, or they've made sacrifices, to be able to have that, but they don't have any additional power to shape production systems. So I think that boundary is important to me for political reasons. But on the production side, there's all of these actors who are entering the points economy and participating in it, who aren't firms in that sense. And there's all these interfaces between those different activities. Like you could have all kinds of hiking associations and travel associations that are collecting points from their members and offering all different kinds of services without payment. And they are relying on certain firms who function as platforms for those hiking or travel associations. And so, the customers of these firms wouldn't be households or other firms, it would be associations. They could be producing intermediate inputs that the associations are paying for. So when you kind of add that associational layer, which is very important to me, because I think many of the basic thing I say is that, many things we produce meet relatively defined needs, where you can have an investment board composed of these stakeholders and evaluation committees deciding whether producers are meeting these needs that we define in some way. But there's many other needs that are relatively undefined or underdefined, like the need for art, and beauty, whatever. There, it's like the customer or the society or the consumer or the people buying that output, they don't really know what it is. There's this really creative dimension to the production. Like if consumers really just decide what cultural production looks like, then we're going to get a lot of crap, because they don't have the capacity to actually the creativity of the producer really matters there. And there's something similar when it comes to spirituality, politics, batch production that has to do with hobbies, new music, all these kinds of things. It's the need that those things meet is very underdefined. And so it's very important that there's this whole associational sector of the economy where those needs are being met. And there's a lot less there's still investment boards making sure that production is happening in a way that is safe, like denying people resources if they're going to be like, oh, we have a hobbyist group that produces guns and rocket launchers, or, is like dumping all of these chemicals into the river. You don't want people to be able to do that, but you want them to have a lot of freedom to explore and define those needs that they're meeting in their own way. So I think when you add that dimension, you see that it's a very porous. That's one of the main ways that it's quite porous. And the other one is that because it's not a single criterion economy and it's very politicized, it breaks open a lot of those dimensions. But I guess on the specific point you mentioned, I would maintain that there are certain separations of household from production that are very politically important to the way the model works. Because I think maybe people think about that as like, if you want to have, I don't think there should be like informal, unregistered household productions. If you're going to make tacos, like you should be registered as a firm and part of that activity. But like, another part of household production is capitalist households and the way they're shaping everything that happens in the production sphere. And that's the kind of stuff we really want to be worried about.
A huge question that arises at this point is, how do we get there, Aaron? So how do you think about the question of transition?
This is a very interesting question because I wrote a whole transition program, and it wasn't included in the published articles. So there is a whole transition program that I've written out, and
Wow.
I can explain to you basically what it is, but I think part of the issue, and I'd have to develop this more with other people. I don't think it's fully, developed, is that it relies a lot on Keynesian ideas, because I think that Keynesianism radical Keynesian, not the Keynesianism we know that kind of emerged in the post-war period, but really there were these radical Keynesians in the 1940s, Keynes himself, Nicholas Caldor, William Beveridge. They were thinking about how, I think, and I defend this in the piece, they were actually thinking about how to get out of capitalism. The world they were trying to get to is not my vision of socialism by any means, but the thing that they developed that I think is really important is that they developed a way to think about how we transition out of capitalism while we're still in a monetary economy. And that, I think, eluded a lot of socialists. Like they had this vision of the world they were trying to build that is a post-profit, but also post-money economy. And they had a lot of trouble thinking about how we get there from the starting point of a current capitalist monetary economy. And a lot of what I call functional finance, which is this emergent idea within these radical Keynesians, is about understanding how once you're no longer interested in protecting private property and money as a store of value, you can think about how to use money to get where you want to go in ways that I think that Marxists generally haven't absorbed. A lot of the critiques of Keynesianism that you see are sort of saying, oh, if the state does this or that, it will be, there's various ways that capitalism will undermine that use of Keynesian methods to achieve economic stability. But actually Keynes himself, I think, was very aware of that. He would have agreed with all those criticisms, and he would have said the goal of these interventions is not to stabilize a capitalist economy. It's to understand how, once we break this function of the need for money to secure a private property economy, we're actually trying to break out of this economy, go somewhere else, then these tools become available to us. If we just use them to stabilize the capitalist economy, they won't work. He's really against that, actually. He thinks that the power of large capitalists to, vary the level of private investment will defeat the efforts of the state to use printing money essentially to achieve various goals. It's when you no longer care about, preserving capitalist control over investment that these monetary tools become useful. So the main thing that Keynes says is that you need basically, this is my version. This is a little bit different from what Keynes says, but this is sort of a version of what he and Beveridge and Caldor were saying. If you want to transition, you need to do three things. You have to have capital controls. So you have to prevent capitalists from leaving your country. You have to have really strong controls on the ability of money to exit. Once you do that, you gain control over your exchange rate and your interest rate. It gives you a lot of internal freedom to organize your economy. The second thing you need to do is you need to break the independence of the central bank and basically the bond market. So what you want to do is you're going to use classical functional finance tools. You're going to monetize the debt. So you're going to start doing things from the state level, and you're going to pay for it by printing money. And you're not going to, sell bonds to capitalists. You're just going to say, hey, we're generating these resources and we're printing money to pay for it. And the third thing that you need to do is, or once you do that, you enter the space of policy autonomy, where the main limit on your activity is your trade balance, what you need from the world and what the world needs from you. So different countries are going to be able to transition alone or in combination with one another to different degrees, insofar as they still exist in a capitalist world, and they need things from that world to survive and produce. And they in turn produce certain things that the world needs, right? So if you produce a lot of oil, or you have some mineral, or you're like China and you're the world's workshop, even though you're doing things the world doesn't like, they still need stuff from you, right? And that's what gives you this space of autonomy. So capital controls, break the independence of the central bank, and then in that situation, your trade balance is the constraint on your activity. Because when you print money, that can only help you locally. If you need foreign goods, then you're dependent on that trade balance to determine what you can do. This is the basics of functional finance. The other thing you need to do once you do this is you need to start attacking the rich. So you need to just start taxing the hell out of them, right? And the main reason to do that, this is very important, is not that it pays for what you're going to do. It's political. You are trying to sharply reduce their ability to, shape political outcomes in society. So you need to rapidly reduce their income and wealth so that they can't shape what happens in society. It's a very difficult problem because a lot of what they have that gives them power is wealth. And so you have to actually confiscate that stuff. But if they stop producing, it's very important from this functional finance perspective that you, as they exit activity, you can just print money to cover that production. So like during COVID, there was all this economic activity that simply stopped happening, and all these people who stopped making incomes, and the state was able to just hand those people money so they could continue to buy things that they needed. And it didn't cause massive inflation. Later on, it did due to supply bottlenecks, but that's like a different story, and we can talk, that's an important source of inflation. But on the whole, as income isn't being generated internal to the economy, you can print money to fulfill that function, which is why you don't need the income of the rich. In order to make this whole thing work, you have to socialize investment. So if you're attacking the rich and you're creating these constraints on international flows and creating the space of autonomy, you have to socialize investment. You have to gain control over the investment function. And so what you're going to do is you're going to have to rapidly set up a national investment board. So I talked a lot about sectoral investment boards. You need a big national investment board, and how politically you're going to argue for the society we're building is you're going to say, we need to do the green transition. We need to, meet people's needs. We need to build all these care facilities. We need to rebuild basically universal basic services, housing, transportation. You're going to say, this is what we're going to do. And you need to try to quickly get public investment to like 60 to 75% of investment, because then it's only when you reach that level that even if there are still private capitalists, you can start to break their control over the investment function. So you have to rapidly increase public investment to a very high level by building all these things that people need. And the thing that Keynes said is that a lot of people imagine Keynesianism as state investment filling in for gaps in private investment. But Keynes said if you try to do that, you'll never win. You'll never be able to stabilize the economy. You have to get to a world where most investment is public, and private investment, it has to be cleared with the state. So even if you have these private companies still operating, they have to show their investment plans to this National Investment Board and get approval for any investment they undertake, which is also how the war production was organized. Once you have veto power over private capital's activity, then, and you have massive amounts of public investment, you've successfully socialized investment. Now the public controls the overall level of investment. And by printing money to fund that investment, if you're technically savvy, you can try to get to a level where that investment generates, total resource utilization. So you're trying to get to a world where you actually, in the context of of this kind of dramatic social change. I'm not saying how you come to power. You could come to power through a revolution. You could win an election. I don't know how, you come to power in many ways. There's an autonomy of the political. This is once you come to power, you have to quickly begin to, get to a place where you're able to stabilize the monetary economy at a high level and actually generate a kind of boom where there's full employment, where resources are being fully utilized, where production is now being reallocated towards meeting people's needs in this very direct way, and where people are experiencing this very positively. Because you have capital controls and because you're taxing the rich, you've basically annihilated their capacity to hold society hostage through their investment decisions. And then you also have to be, when they are trying to break you, you have to nationalize the activities that you have to threaten them with immediate nationalization if they refuse to produce. And once you do this, if you can achieve this, then you've won. Like you've created a stable monetary economy, you've socialized investment, you're meeting people's needs, you've broken the power of capital, and now what you need to do is transition. And so that's when you start to do this stuff where you allow workers to vote to move their economy and their firms over to this other public system, which gives them access to investment funds that maybe they don't have access to otherwise. They have to like vote to transition to have to no longer be privately owned. What else do you have to do? You have to start to devolve the investment board. So you start off with a single national investment board. It has to devolve into the sectoral boards, and there has to be more and more democratic control over how those boards are managed. So that's how you get the sectoral investment boards devolve from the overall investment board. You transition the firms over. You have to build all these technical associations of workers that generate expertise and organize workers that will require unions to change how they're organized. Has to be very different constitutions for them. And like somehow after you've done all this, the very final piece of the puzzle is that you implement the credits points system. It's the final step once you've done everything else. But it would be a massive undertaking. It would require a population fully, largely convinced of the need for dramatic change and convinced of it through the possibilities for both, really meeting people's needs and breaking the power of the rich and transitioning firms over to worker management. But yeah, so there is a whole. The last thing, sorry, is you have to try to do an orderly wind down of the financial system. So the system we're describing has no financial markets. You have to get everyone out of them, and so in the proposal there are these what I call transitional annuity bonds, which are these non-tradable financial instruments that each bond gives you an income for a certain number of years. So let's say each bond gives you $10 a year in payments. And the idea is that once you're doing all this, the financial markets are going to go haywire and they're going to start collapsing. And so you open this window at the now no longer independent Fed where you say, we'll buy your assets, your distressed assets. We'll buy up any asset from you. And each asset will have a certain number of transitional annuity bonds that you receive in exchange that entitle you to an income. So basically what it does is it moves everyone over to fixed income rather than like fixed income assets. So it's really important, like a lot of the people in the society, if it's a rich country, are going to have retirement funds. And so you need to basically create this Fed window that buys all of the assets of these pension funds and essentially nationalizes them and forces them over into a defined benefit system where they're just receiving an income. And then you eventually force all private actors to translate all of their wealth into these transitional annuity bonds. They can be organized like the ones that, Daniel Soros mentions a similar idea that basically like the price of these transitional annuity bonds continuously rises. So if you're a rich person and you buy in early, you get a better deal than if you wait. If you're like a holdout counter-revolutionary, you're going to get very few of these. You have a low income. And the idea of the transitional annuity bonds is after a certain number of years, they expire. And so once we've translated all financial assets into these bonds, they pay out an income for a certain number of years and then they all expire. And at that point you have an economy without any private financial wealth. So that's the transition program. Sorry, you didn't realize when you asked that question, I have a whole worked out program that I wanted.
I did not.
Yeah.
Oh, it's great. Really interesting. And it absolutely seems as if you're engaged with this question quite a bit. I mean, I do have a couple of questions also. I'm not sure if well, I mean, first of all, it assumes a strong state. It's a very statist perspective, I guess, I mean, that for sure. And also I think you mentioned it also that, I mean, smaller countries, it's not as easily an option for countries of different sizes and economic, political, and military apparatuses, let's say, because, I mean, there is, of course, the looming question of coups and military invasions by the capitalist class and stuff like that. So one can imagine a country like, I mean, in the case of China, for example, they successfully defended against these kinds of things because they are as large as they are. Chile, not so much.
Yeah.
They suffered a different fate. So, I mean, there's this question, of course, and the other large part would be, and you pointed at it as well, but how to come to power is, of course, a question relating to transition before the transition that you talked about, So how can we build this massive popular power that is able to not only bring a government that is committed to this cause into power, but that can sustain a certain form of mass movement and mass mobilization behind this government in order to fence against various attacks coming from the capitalist class and the right in general, I guess. So, yeah, I mean, these things, of course, but they are the classical.
I think part of it to me is like that, sometimes I think it's more of an implementation program than a transition program, because transition people usually mean how do we get from where we are today with no power to there. And I guess to me, like, I think that the real problem is like currently people focus a lot on the question of how we get power, but have no idea what to do when they get there. So, you have like in Bangladesh, you had all these radical students, like, they had all these problems with society. Actually, they won a lot more quickly than they expected. They took over the government. And you know what they did when they did that? They had no idea what to do. And so they just brought Muhammad Yunus in to run a unity government. Because actually, like most ideas about politics are so focused on the question how to get power, they don't actually know what you would do if you had it. And I see that as a much bigger problem in our times. I mean, obviously, I think that, there's probably a lot of potential for organizing and trying to build and obtain power in the way people's imagine, sort of gradually going. And I certainly think we should, agitate to show people that socialism is possible and try to, we can have all these things like that. But actually, the way that political change happens, it's often a lot more rapid and discontinuous than what people realize. And being ready with a plan of action, I think, is very important. Obviously, countries will be able to do this to different extent. Being small or large, I think the possibility for military coups that you said is very important. But, if you can, as we enter this multipolar world, if you can, find protection from those kind of interventions, then the trade balance will matter more. So some small countries actually have more possibility of gaining autonomy through revolution because they have resources that the world really needs compared to others. So if you can avoid avoiding military coups, that's all like some other part of that's not my part to develop. I'm just trying to say how you would, like, I think again, it's sort of like there's all this focus on all these ways we could be defeated. That's totally important. But I think people focus on those things because they have no idea how to actually do it. They don't have any proposal about how we get to where we're going. Do you know what I mean? Like, all the focus on the ways we could be defeated blocks us from the true problem at the center of our politics, which is we don't have any idea what it would mean to win and how to get there. That's what I'm trying to, unfold in more detail. There's many ways you could lose along the way, but what would it mean to win? I think that's kind of the key question. But I think what you said at the beginning about the from below aspects, like, that is really important. And I think that, my idea is that the proposal I'm offering actually does have a lot of room from the below activity for a few reasons. One is that, you would want to, there's a lot of space for, because what you're building is this democratic economy, and because it's a multi-criterial economy, there's all this space for ways to think about how to maintain populations as mobilized through these struggles, through beginning to build, like it's not that you build this national investment board and run it for 10 years and then start to devolve it. You can, from the beginning, start to build out the systems that allow mobilized people to influence what all of that looks like, integrating them into the decision processes of these, we're doing a green transition. Like my whole point is that there's many possible ways you could do that, many positive visions of green transition that point us toward alternative futures. And so you'd want to, have these mobilized populations really like already starting to influence the decisions and how these decisions are being implemented at this investment board level, so that that devolutionary impulse is kind of like being organized from the beginning, that people have more control over investment decisions. You're going to want to have all these possibilities for workers to take over their workplaces, to like vote to enter this like sector where they become public nonprofit institutions and expropriate their employers, and then can start to act on all of these different goals. I think that, to me, part of the reason why left movements, and here I would include social democracy and even Keynesian ideas alongside, different forms of statist socialisms, they had a goal in mind. They have like a technocratic goal of what they imagine the economy should be doing. And that requires them to suppress a lot of that democratic from below energy, because if the workers are like caring more about trading off producing more against, having more satisfying work or not working as much, they have to suppress those impulses in order to force society into this like classically developmental income progress focused track. And here we are from the get-go saying we have many different goals and we need all of this democratic input to imagine futures. We need this very, highly active civil society that's generating all of these possible futures that we could head towards. And so you'd want from the get-go to integrate those. But the point is that it's not enough to just think about the from below stuff. You need the things I'm describing are sort of like the macro institutions and structures that will inflate the economy, generate social stability, raise people out of this condition of, like deep insecurity and fear, especially in the context of the transition, to free them to participate in this emergent and massive civil society effort to decide where we're going. So I think, in my initial description, I really emphasized what we have to do to get this thing off the ground. But I think the whole point of it is that the very form of organization of it allows for a lot more democratic, ways of like democratic input to decide how we should meet these goals and what they should look like. I think a big problem with, the beverage version, all these different things, is like they assumed that, we would need these wage agreements where like, there's a certain acceptable level of profit. Like they kind of wanted to maintain the capitalist system in miniature for a lot longer than I'm describing. Whereas I think for me, the goal is very quickly to start to transition all these firms over to this other system. So a lot of the ways that they ended up having to intervene, it wasn't just technocratic about the goals, but technocratic about determining the share of income that went to wages versus profits. In what I'm saying, we would be just very quickly eradicating profit as a goal. And so, we wouldn't have that additional point that I think hampered these previous methods where they were trying to, constrain workers organizing around wage levels. But there's a lot of difficulties all along the way. Like I'm describing a world where you would still need, your ability to move forward depends on your trade balance. If you're in Bangladesh, that means like you need the garment sector to continue to operate. And so like, how do you do that? How do you keep the garment sector operating to give you the access to foreign exchange that you need in order to do everything else that you need to do in your economy, while recognizing that the conditions there are absolutely horrible and that people rising up are going to be rising up against conditions that pertain in these export sectors? I think those are all really difficult questions that, we would have to really think about how to solve in advance, how to like keep that democratic energy and still generate the kinds of macro conditions that allow this like unfolding, exciting, democratic, like freeing of society from the fetters of the efficiency focused economy, how we would achieve that coherently.
And I saw on your website that you are building up a movement for multidimensional economics, right? At least there is a newsletter, and it kind of suggests, without being very explicit, that there is something forming.
I want there to be something. And
what is it that is forming?
The truth is I just started this new job, as you mentioned at the top of the program.
Yeah.
So, right now I'm a little overworked to develop it, but I do really want to do that. And, I want to really build this out and for it to be a collective effort. I still have, 2 book versions of this that I'm working on that I want to publish, but I'm also working with an economist to develop some formal models of the economy. And I want to, involve all of these people and kind of collaboratively build out this idea, which I've sketched here also in your program. Yeah. So if people are interested, don't expect an immediate response. I'm just one man and I'm a little too overworked at the moment, but I do really want to build this out collaboratively. So I'm really interested in people who want to work on that.
Nice. Very much looking forward to that. Aaron, there's a last question that I ask my guests at the end, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Well, I think that in a lot of ways, it's like an easy and a hard question for me to answer, because I'm saying that, we should have an economy built around human flourishing, and I think that, like, when I imagine a future, it's that, in a way, like Keynes says in the economic possibilities of our grandchildren, that we can solve the economic problems of our society, which in my case would mean reorganizing society to be able to accommodate all of these different values. And I think we could live in a world where, like, we reorganize production so that, we live in a world that's beautiful, that, like, generates all of these kind of public community spaces, while at the same time protecting individual autonomy and allowing us to pursue our passions across, like, whether it's chess clubs or natural wine or, or religious things that we care about, or spiritual or whatever. Like, I just imagine a world, sustainable, good quality, all these different goals. I think that people would feel, I try to talk about it as this kind of abundance, where abundance isn't about endless access to goods and services, but this feeling of fullness of life, that I have choices that I can make in my life about how I want to spend my limited time, my limited resources across a range of good options for my life. And, I have so many friends and connections and so many opportunities to realize myself in the world. And the choice I have to make is which of these lives I want to live, how I want to combine the things that matter to me into a whole. And I think that, like, it is so, to me, it is just like, it's really possible to imagine a world that's really satisfying, where it's not this set of obstacles. We're trying to live well is like swimming against the tide of the world. I think that kind of world is very deeply possible, and with the multi-criterial perspective, I'm really trying to describe what that world is. But what I always try to emphasize is that we can set up that world in many different ways. And there's going to be a lot of social contention around which of these positive worlds, how we combine our social resources to achieve that. So it's somehow a vision, on the one hand, of a world where we get to live in a world that really incorporates all these values, from care and sustainability to free time and beauty and all of that kind of stuff, that combines them and balances them and produces a much fuller life than what we have now. But it will always be a particular version of that combination. And that will involve a lot of politics, contention, disagreement, disharmony. And I think you can imagine part of what would be joyful about this world is the feeling that we finally figured out how to organize politics in this way where it really surfaces what our options are, and we're fighting over different positive futures, you know? It's not like the politics we have today. That's horrible, because it's really about which class of capitalists is going to dominate us. You know, do you choose dominator A or dominator B? Like, we could get to a world where politics is actually this like meaningful choice where conflict is about like surfacing what really matters to us and choosing across these options rather than what we have now. So it's a very much, for me anyway, I think it's the whole thing gives me joy.
That's fantastic. Aaron, thank you so much for taking part in Future Histories.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.